Thanks for coming. Find a seat. Welcome. We're really delighted. This is a very special event for lots of reasons. We're delighted to welcome Michael Moore, translator of this new Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, which is getting lots of wonderful notice in the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker magazine. And Michael will be in conversation with our very own beloved Canio Pavone, without whom none of us would be here. As many of you know, Canio founded the bookshop in 1980 and is still a vital part of the runnings of the store. Canio has a lifelong career as a teacher of Italian language and literature, and also has taught Spanish as well as Japanese. The man is irrepressible, has many talents, has delivered seminars here on Dante, on contemporary Italian poets and other topics. So Canio will be in conversation with Michael Moore. We're very pleased to welcome to Canio's books. Michael is the acclaimed translator of 20th century classics such as Agostino by Alberto Moravia and Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, among other some contemporary novels. Michael is former chair of the Penheim Translation Fund. He holds a PhD in Italian from NYU, New York University. For many years has served as interpreter at the United Nations and is a full-time member of the Permanent Mission of Italy to the United Nations. It's a special treat. This is a monumental book. It's a monumental work of translation. And we're thrilled to have you both. Please give a warm welcome now to Canio.
Thank you, Marianne. And indeed, it is a monumental book. And I just wonder, I mean, for every Italian, it's like Moby Dick for the Americans, but in the United States, it isn't that much known, and in spite of that, the book, which just came out a few months ago, has become the new translation by Michael has become like the event of the publishing season this year. And I kid you not. I mean, the New Yorker didn't write a review. They wrote an essay about the book and the translation. A wonderful essay, really, by Joan, as well as the New York Review of Books. And why is that all happening? Why, I wonder.
It's funny, I think the first review was from the Wall Street Journal, and they called it hidden in plain sight, you know. And I think, yes, in Italy everyone knows it. They read it in school. I wouldn't even compare it to Moby Dick, because how many people actually read Moby Dick? I mean, you know, Italians know it by heart. When I meet them and I say that I'm doing this, they always have some line, and they say, how did you translate this?
Yeah.
You know, there's always some line or other. I remember, you know, back when I was a kid, our librarian actually had a list of great books that we should read, and it was there. And it was sort of always mentioned among the classics. But I think by the time I took on the project, it was probably only being read in Italian courses and by, you know, ambitious people that sort of did want to tackle the great books. And, you know, people would wonder why, Italians would wonder why, and I always thought that the previous translations were kind of flat, you know. It's such a colorful book. You know, it's funny, Manzoni invented Italian, modern Italian. You know, he's a great stylist. The language is very vivid, very alive, and constantly changing. He wrote it at a time when there was no Italy, right? Italy was not a nation yet. I don't know if you're classical music lovers, but he was so mourned when he died. Verdi wrote his Requiem, which is played often, and that was written for Manzoni. So I always felt like, you know, first of all, let's face it, you're Italian, you know. I mean, there is kind of a prejudice in the publishing industry toward everything French. The French classics, the Russian classics, you know. And as Joan Acocella said, she said, if you care about the 19th century, if you like these big novels, read this. But I honestly felt, my bet, la scommessa, as Italians would say, was that the problem was that wasn't translated for what made it great, for the beauty of the language. And so I really worked very hard on doing that. And also, there's a lot of talk, people talk about Tolstoy and the new translations of Tolstoy. Everyone is taking it on, right? There's been new translations of Madame Bovary, for example, of Proust. And when I've looked at some of the older translations, not just of this, but at the things that I read as a kid, they were so involved with decorous language, with trying to elevate the prose, that they didn't realize that it didn't have to be written in elevated prose. I wanted to use the language of today, but to look at what made it beautiful. And with sound, I wanted it to sound right. So I listened to the Italian audiobook. I listened to a lot of opera. I listened to Verdi, to the Ballo in Maschera, and that sort of really takes you into the spirit of it. So I approached it that way.
Something amazing that you did, I think, is reading the English and having read the Italian. You can almost feel the rhythms of the Italian language in the English. I mean, for instance, there's that expression in Italian, pian piano, which means little by little, just repeating, and the Italians repeat, presto presto, and you did that. And when I said, she went slowly toward the heart, and I thought, I could hear Manzoni.
It's funny, and I had to struggle with the editors over that, because they're like, what are these repetitions? I'm like, no. But I mean, those of you who know opera too will recognize that from like Mozart or from Rossini, zit, piano, piano. And, he takes a lot of language from opera. There is actually, one other thing I would say about it, there's a lightheartedness to a lot of it. He has a sense of humor, there's a sense of irony that didn't come through in some of the previous versions, I think. And and I think that, it's like a puppet theater sometimes, and he'll tell you that sometimes, and he's always breaking into the story.
Absolutely. And, you see the Betrothed, so you think, well, it's a love story, and it is. It's a love story, but it's much, much more than a love story. I mean, the love story, keeps going, but it's constantly interrupted for about 50 pages here and 30 pages here. What else is it besides a love story?
Jeez, I mean, I think it's so much. I mean, I always say it's like an encyclopedia of style. There's that, but it's a fresco of the Italian people and of Italian society. He takes every class of Italy, and he talks about, in his case, the state of Milan, by which he means like the region, which is pretty much what we would call Lombardy today, in a kind of state of siege. It's occupied by the Spanish. So it's also about colonization. It's about justice, I think, is the biggest theme of all. Justice and injustice, rich against poor, good against evil. Truth. A historical truth. And he's also, one of the most, as I was finishing it and revising it, of course we had that terrible pandemic, and there are 2 chapters toward the end which talk about the plague of 1630, the bubonic plague. And it's just chilling how similar it is to what we just went through when he starts, because he says, I'm not going to tell you, he says, I'm not going to give you the best version, but I'm going to give you the necessary version, because he was also attacking the way history had been written. And so he gives you the accounts of what happened in those years. So it's pure history at that point.
It's amazing how he can just stop the action. Here you're following the lovers who are fleeing from the bad people, and he just stops it for 2 chapters to go into to talk about the plague, and it's kind of like a MSNBC report, with photos almost, but the photos are all verbally and wonderful.
He's very visual too, I have to say. In the original edition, there were engravings, of the various characters for a reason. I mean, some say it was just to protect the book from piracy, which is a big issue. There are a lot of pirate editions. He lost money on it, and he actually had to sue one of the publishers, Limonier, for coming out with a pirate edition. He won, but after years, of course. But on the cover, what they did was they took 2 of the original engravings, one of the female protagonist, Lucia Mondella, and then the other of the nun of Monza, who is an incredible character and an incredible portrait, I think, of a woman forced into a destiny that she did not want, forced into the convent. And then they repeated it, and then they put the orange cover, and it's exactly what I wanted to do, which was to be faithful to the original, but with a modern touch.
Yeah.
So
And like the Nun of Monza, the story of the Nun of Monza is like a novel into itself.
yes,
And not only the Nun of Monza, but other characters. There are some other featured characters, very strong characters. You get their whole backstory, which are all of these little novelle in the big romanzo. You know?
yeah. Some people, I mean, his storytelling style, some find frustrating. They talk about these digressions, but I love the digressions. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
and I always thought Manzoni has a great sense of balance. Like he'll start to go in one direction and with one style, with one mood maybe, and then he's just like, I don't want to bore my reader, and he'll say, well, if you don't like this part, you can skip ahead to the end of the chapter. You know, I mean, he's very personal, but I like that variety that he has. You know, that's why there's a little bit of everything in there. You know, there's a lot of morality, a lot of religion, definitely, history, as we said.
Well, the history, I mean, this is a historical novel, right? We've come to, historical novels these days don't have a very good name because they're like more novel than history. Whereas he had his own feeling about what a historical novel should be.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. He was following Walter Scott, the the writer of Ivanhoe, which was hugely popular in Europe in those years. But unlike Scott, who used a kind of archaic English to talk about 17th century Scotland and England, he said, no, I'm going to use modern Italian. He invented modern Italian in the process because think of Italy and its geography with that mountain chain that divides it. Then add to that the politics of the time, the fact that different European countries controlled different parts of Italy. You know, so you had France in one part, Spain in another part, Austria in another part. You know, so and you had the population pretty much 80 or more % illiterate. So unlike French or English, which became unified national languages relatively early, which I think of as an aid to writers, Italy sort of did not have a unified language. It did have the language of the poets, but that was based upon the model of Dante and Petrarch, so it's sort of amazing. And when you see opera, for example, the language of Mozart, for example, that gives you an idea of the Italian that Manzoni inherited. So he said, no, we need a national language. I mean, he is a national hero in Italy for that reason.
And speak about how he really wrote the book twice.
Yes.
Did it all, and it was very successful the first time.
Yeah.
Very, and then he wrote it again.
Yeah. Well, it's actually more than, it was 3 times. I mean, the first version was not published, and they call it Fermo e Lucia because Renzo was called Fermo initially. And there was a whole second version of that. And then he did finally publish it in 1827. It was a big success, but he's from Milano, okay? He grows up speaking Milanese dialect. He goes to school where they're teaching in Latin and French. So he was literate in French. He spoke Lombardo. He knew Florentine Italian, the Italian spoken in Florence, which is sort of the model because of that historic reason. And he wrote in Italian using dictionaries, using the books of the past. And then when the book came out, of course the Florentines were like, well, some of the language is archaic. He was very critical of it. And so he went back and he revised it. The Italians used an expression, or he used an expression, to wash it in the waters of the Arno. The Arno being the river going through Florence. He wanted to make it more purely Florentine. So he went to Florence, but only for a month, with his family, with like 8 carriages full of stuff. Only stayed a month because his wife was sick again, poor thing, having all those children. And but did get a couple of advisors who sort of helped him revise it. And then he came out with it again in 1840, more or less. And what I think is, making changes, and it's a little bit shorter, but it's refined, and you can see that in the quality of the language that he uses, that it has that careful attention. Not just to being Tuscan, but to sounding right. I mean, he was a poet also, and that comes through, I think. And I tried to bring out that quality in the translation as well, that these are not just a series of sentences, that there's reversals, there's repetitions of certain words, there's a play on words within each paragraph. Each paragraph is almost like a prose poem of sorts.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say about it, though, in terms of what it is, some would say that this is a novel that creates the Italian character. The way, you know, sometimes people say we read a book and we shape ourselves by the characters that we read. This is very much like that. In the same, this is a little bit later out comes Pinocchio, you know, which is also sort of a story of the Italian character. It might seem like a strange comparison to you, but I find it very apt that Pinocchio is all about Pinocchio becoming a boy, right? And this is all about like Renzo becoming a man, you know, and making mistakes along the way, and being beset by misfortune and injustices along the way. So I think it's very, very strong the theme of injustice and of behavior, you know.
Yeah, and the fulfillment, the final fulfillment of the love interest, in spite of all of the problems that they're having, but
in the Lazzaretto, right?
Yeah.
You know? I mean, that, you know, in a way, just to give you a better idea of the plot, you know, to simplify it, which the New Yorker did not do, but, you know, this young couple wants to marry, but the evil overlord has his eye on the girl, and he forbids, he frightens, basically, through his henchmen, the local priest into not marrying them. And then he tries to stage a kidnapping of the girl to bring her to his castle. And they miraculously escape from that because they're trying to pull off something else, and they have to escape from their town. And in a certain sense, once they leave, which so many Italians are so attached to where they're from, you know, and I think the dream of so many Italians, even today, if they have to go overseas or, you know, abroad for their profession, they still would rather be in Italy, no matter what, anyone that you talk to. And here instead, this is a peasant couple. They work in the silk trade. She spins silk at home. He works in the factory. And all they want to do is get married and live in this little village, Pescarenico, on Lake Como, on the Lecco branch of it. And instead they have to leave for their lives. She has to go into this convent. He's supposed to go to Milano. And they just get drawn into the maelstrom of history. And and it's just sort of it's kind of terrifying. And then ultimately they are reunited in the plague, because she ends up in Milano. She caught the plague and gets better. He caught the plague and got better. It's interesting that the peasants got better. The nobles died. And he goes to rescue her from the labyrinth. I'm calling it the labyrinth. I think often of Dante and Dante's hell, because when you get to this Lazzaretto, which is where people were brought, they call it a laser house maybe in English. That's where they used to bring people with leprosy. When you think of, you know, Lazarus and who Lazarus was, not the Lazarus of Christ, but there's another Lazarus, I get them confused. But that's where people were brought. She is brought there, and he goes into the Lazzaretto to save her. You know, it's quite mysterious. It's sort of like a reversal almost. But in order to save her own life, she had taken a vow never to marry.
That's amazing. The extent to which religion plays a part.
Yeah.
Her vow. I talked about her vow, and then hypocrisy on one hand, and the conversion of the really evil people who become saintly. It's amazing. Yeah,
it is. First of all, the idea of conversion is so central to Italian literature. I mean, if you think of Dante again, it's a comparison I make. And remembering, too, that Manzoni is important to Italians in prose as Dante is in poetry. That's the stature that he has within Italy. There's a conversion of the Nameless One, who's a sort of evil Gothic character. There's a very popular aspect to the novel, you know, and I think it's often been misinterpreted as something that's sort of heavy and too serious. But no, it's like, you know, it's very good storytelling, and it's scary. And this is a time when I say Gothic, you're talking the Romantic era, early 19th century. Anne Radcliffe writing these gruesome stories about evil Italian counts, usually, you know. She'd never been to Italy, never been to the Alps, but does these amazing descriptions that somehow, you know, Manzoni reminds me of a little bit. But the Nameless One, you know, just has this kind of midnight conversion. You know, you think of St. John of the Cross and, you know, the long
and
dark
he is
nights.
almost the devil. I mean, he is so evil. People just shudder in his presence, and it's because Lucia fears that he's going to be attacking her, that she makes this promise to the Madonna, that if the Madonna gets her out of this situation, she'll be a virgin forever. She'll not marry. She'll be not and
And then, you know,
We shouldn't tell you what
poor Renzo, you know, he goes through hell, literally, you know, to get to her, and she's like, sorry.
when they can finally get together, and she said, "But I made this promise to the Madonna."
And so luckily, one of the, you know, one of the heroes is this Capuchin monk. I'm always afraid of saying monk or friar because, you know, there's a big difference. He's
a cappuccino.
A cappuccino, but monk stays in the monastery, right? But he travels, so I think I get it all confused anyway. I don't know if anyone is an expert on this, but at any rate, it's Padre Cristoforo, you know, and he steps in to, first of all, he tells Lorenzo that he has to forgive their tormentor, the evil lord that prevented them from being married. So there's a very strong message of the need for forgiveness. And that is a conversion as well, you know.
Yeah.
Renzo has to be converted to wanting to forgive. The evil lord has to be converted before, within the Catholic religion, you know, you can, if you repent at the moment before death, then you are saved, you know. And then Lucia, in a certain sense, has to convert from her promise, her vow, and has to be persuaded that since the vow was made under duress, and since she had a previous vow with Renzo, that kind of trumps the second vow in order for it to happen. You know, so it's a little bit convoluted, but you know.
But meanwhile, there's hypocrisy also. The hypocrisy of Don Abbondio.
Don Abbondio.
Don Abbondio, who's almost a cartoon character. Yeah.
He is. Like I was thinking, Alberto Sordi. I was trying.
Alberto Sordi.
Yes, he's like. I mean, Italians sometimes object when I call him the Italian everyman because he's so feckless. You know, he's just trying to get by. He's this little parish priest, you know, and they say he's like a clay pot among iron kettles.
Yeah.
That's one of the great descriptions.
Yeah.
But he's also a beloved character, and but because of his fear, his timorousness before this Don Rodrigo, you know, he doesn't stand up to him. But he is a comic character in a way.
Yeah.
And he also comes around at the very end, too.
At the very end,
yeah.
almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting what you said before about when they leave, they don't really want to leave like so many Italian immigrants. I think that in the Great Migration, when they came to the United States, I remember my grandfather, as a little boy, telling me about his hometown with the mountains and how he was going to go back there. I mean, they just came here, and I've heard this is true. Other people told me they just came here to kind of make some money because they were desperately poor in southern Italy, and then they would go back to their mountains, the campagna.
Yeah, that was the dream.
That was their dream. Of course, they never went back. You know, some had families, and here we all are. But there's that wonderful passage. I'd love you to read it.
Sure.
There's one when Lucia. Do you want to set it up, or do you want me to set it up?
You can set it up. Yeah.
Well, Lucia and Renzo have to escape because the warlord is after them, and his bravi, which are the thugs, they're chasing them, and so they have to escape from their little town with Lucia's mother Agnese. And they get into the boat. They have to cross the river Ada to get to the other side. And I get a little choked up thinking about it. But at one point she turns around and she looks at the mountains. Read it.
And this is what she says.